What if the details of your attachment style could explain your sexual stuff? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me. Yeah, I believe it can, and we're going to get into some of those deep weeds in this conversation, which I am so excited to bring you. Yes, your sexual story, and in particular, some of the details of your experience of attachment, good, bad, or otherwise, explains a lot about what around sex is good, bad, or ugly for you, about how that works itself out in your marriage if you're married, in your relationships more broadly, whether or not you're married, what you think about intimacy and sex and even God. My guest for this conversation is Jay Stringer. Jay is a licensed mental health counselor, a researcher, an author of the award-winning book Unwanted. He's also an ordained minister. We're going to get into some of the details of, first of all, what attachment is and how and why it makes such an important paradigm to understand your sexual stuff, your sexual story, the challenges, brokenness or otherwise you may be experiencing around sex now. And then we'll talk about what the path forward can look like. Okay, once we understand some of this, then what do we do about it? How do we get out of the mess? Yes, there is some really powerful and hopeful things to share in that light. So, my friend Jay Stringer. Well, Jay Stringer, it's been a while since we've had you on the podcast. I consider you a friend. This is going to be a great conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Carol, thank you for having me back on. I was trying to think about it. I'm in a different state. You might be in a different state as well, but I think that our first conversation was when I was in Seattle.
Yes.
Is that right? I forget which year it was.
It has been. It was not long after you released your book Unwanted.
Okay. Yes.
So you had not yet moved from Seattle. So
yes.
Yeah, now you're on the other coast.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, those who have been listening or watching me for the last little while know we've been talking a lot about intimacy, sexuality, sexual story, and this is right in the middle of where you have been doing such important, thoughtful, and helpful work. As we get started, how did you find interest in and get into the field of sexuality, relationships, intimacy, sexual story? How did all that come to be a thing for you?
I would probably say reluctantly. I often think about like what would my middle school self think about me talking about these subjects, and
Yeah.
I would not be well as a middle schooler if I knew this was my future. But a couple different things I would say. There was a confluence of a couple different categories. The first was I was part of a church community in the North Seattle area, and we were doing a lot of work in just a poorer neighborhood that had a lot of, uh, they called them Johns, but essentially men who bought prostitution driving around our neighborhood. And so early on, the city of Seattle started something called a John School, which was basically a diversion of sentencing for men who had been arrested. And so that was kind of one of the first places that I got known in the city for working with men who, solicited women in prostitution. And as I got known for that, a lot of other unwanted sexual behavior topics started coming to my clinic. And that would just be, porn, extramarital affairs, but also like desire discrepancies. Like, what do you do when two partners have different desires? Like, one has seemingly more high desire, the other one has more low. So that would be kind of like some professional background. But then as I have looked at my own story as it relates to being a pastor's kid, growing up in a Southern Baptist high school, that, it's just not a place that you want to go to learn anything productive or generative about sex. So I had just a lot of lack of education growing up in my family, but also in the church and faith communities I was part of. And then in college and grad school was just struggling a lot with my own pornography use. And so I would say that's where the confluence of a family history of never talking about sex or rarely talking about it, faith system that did not engage it well and almost always pathologized problems. I always make the joke that, learning about sex in a Christian context can often feel like you're going to culinary school to learn how to cook, and all they teach you is about food poisoning. So I would just say, like, all those things together of the church that I was working closely with, some of my own unaddressed sexual brokenness, and then just realizing, like, I have received not just an inheritance, but I've received an inheritance as it relates to sexual shame and difficulties. So all of those things have come together into this odd, remarkable life that we both have. So
Yeah. Well, I join with you I would never have imagined speaking into any of these topics, years and years ago. I am surprised as well, and would have been
what were
shocked.
you on the path for? What
Well,
was early Carol
I,
desiring?
I was I was fully into medicine,
Okay.
into OBGYN. And now I can say it almost chuckling, but part of me went into OBGYN because I never wanted to have to deal with a man again. I never wanted to have to
Mm,
treat or, touch. And that came out of my own junk. I didn't realize that
yes.
at the time. Um,
Yes.
and so as I eventually learned that and had to deal with my own story, so much became clearer. And I also did realize that as I was talking and working with women in some of the most intimate aspects of their lives and bodies and relationships, facts weren't enough, that there was
Mm,
always meaning underneath. I could write prescriptions or do surgery or even deliver babies, but there was emotional content underneath that I had no equipping to deal with, and that was also part of what pushed me in where I'm focusing now. Um,
so
Jay,
good. Yes.
you have, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, been using the attachment paradigm in thinking about sexuality, intimacy, relationships. Some of our listeners may understand what we mean when we say attachment, but let me give you a minute to just unpack that and what we mean when we say that.
Sure. Yeah. So attachment is basically a word that is trying to assess, like, how well connected, how well seen, safe, soothed, and secure did you feel with the meaningful people in your life. So Dan Siegel, I think one of the best parenting experts out there, he uses what he refers to as the 4 S's to talk about your attachment to your parents. And so those are seen, safe, soothed, and secure. So seen is, you had a mother or a father that did not just kind of see your physical needs, but they really saw into your emotional needs. So when you came home from a bad day of school, when you had a breakup, when something was just kind of not well in your life, they were attuned. They saw what was difficult and basically responded to that. But it wasn't just about, things that were negative in your life. They also knew what, like, lit you up. Like, if you were to go on a trip, a road trip, a special vacation, like, they would know how to plan a really beautiful, stunning weekend for you or a birthday. So seen is that experience of, like, you see my physical needs, but you also have seen into my heart, and you know what kind of brings both grief and life to me. So that would be the S. Seen. And then safe is, the world is a place of a lot of dysregulation, a lot of chaos, a lot of unpredictable experiences. And so we need to have a caregiver that is able to be safe for us in the midst of that. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, we did not come from mothers and fathers who were safe. Maybe they were a place of dysregulation. And so, again, I don't know your whole history in terms of what you described just recently, but that sense of, if men are not safe, you're speaking a bit to your attachment to men.
Yes,
And so
yes,
that sense of, maybe it had to do with something sexual, maybe it was just emotional. But part of what we're kind of beginning to link is there is a relationship between the attachment that we have to our primary caregivers, some of the adverse childhood experiences that we've been through, and some of the sexual and relational difficulties that find ourselves later. So I can do the other two S's, but I also don't want to take up too much time talking about uh, seen, safe, soothed, and secure. Let me talk about soothing before.
Yeah.
Soothing is essentially like all of us as kids are going to have these really big, turbulent emotions, and one of the things that I learned from a theorist by the name of Winnicott. He was an object relations theorist, and he essentially compared good parenting to what we see Jesus doing on the cross. That he would say, when Jesus dies on the cross, humanity had to give its worst violence, its worst aggression. And Jesus had to be able to experience that, had to metabolize that, had to suffer it, had to die. But then in coming back to life, essentially what Jesus shows humanity is like all of your anger, all your violence, all your scapegoating is not enough. Like there, I am going to be able to overcome that.
Yeah.
And Winnicott takes that and then says that's what good parents offer is they basically say to their kids, you can bring me all your worst anxiety, all your anger, all your unaddressed stuff, because that's where you want these things to be played out, is with your parents. And if you can have that happen, and your parent is a place of soothing, that's very, very important to develop a concept called differentiation, which is to know who you are, to feel strong and secure in who you are. And if you don't have that, and relationships are not a primary place of soothing, that's often what happens in middle school or late adolescence. Is people, instead of going to a secure attachment, instead of going to relationship, they go to unwanted behaviors, and that could be too much screen time, too much alcohol, drug use, sex, porn, to basically, on one version, find the level of soothing that they lacked in their primary attachments. And so that's the importance of going back, is not necessarily to blame or to find fault with our parenting or our parents or some of the difficulties that we came from, but all of us have to reckon with the story of where we come from in order to shape where we want to go in the future.
Mm. Jay, you've said so much, and I could go with so many questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I want to get next to how that impacts our sexuality, and you've already alluded to this, but that pattern of how a child grows and develops, good, bad, or ugly, in
Mm-hmm.
some of these deep heart matters, plays out in just our relationships and perhaps sexuality in particular. I am thinking that maybe some of our uh, Christian listeners will say, well, why should I have to worry about all this? The Bible says in Christ, I'm a new creature. Why do I have to go back and unpack all of that? And I have an answer for that, but I would love to hear your answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
Just put that
Sure.
in a context, attachment,
Yeah,
sexuality, and even what God
yeah.
says about all this.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been thinking about recently would just be, the church is often a place of discipleship with regard to sanctification, justification, some sense of relationship with God and intimacy, but there is almost no sexual discipleship as it relates to just our own sexual story. So I think of like Romans 12:2, which would be, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, which I think the church somewhat gets right. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's one of those things that I think, if we're honest in the believing community, we have very few resources, less than adequate, to be able to help us to really understand and renew our sexual mind. And so if you are coming from a faith tradition or a church community, very rarely are those people saying, okay, well, tell me about your relationship with your mom and your dad, adverse childhood experiences. When you really get into dreams that people have had, the fantasies that bring people to orgasm, just some of, thoughts, feelings about an ex from high school or from college, or when you go back to your high school reunion and all of these thoughts and feelings begin to emerge. There are so few places in our world to be able to process that. So I
Yeah,
remember when I was in
yeah.
grad school. Oh, Go
Hey,
for it.
excuse me. I just want to interrupt for a second. You alluded to what the church has done reasonably well and not. I think so much, from my perspective, what the church has done is focused on what's on or not on the sin list. Sometimes argued about it, but has talked about behaviors, but haven't done anything to deal with the right brain, the heart, whatever words or paradigm you want to use there, some of these matters of the heart.
Exactly. Yep. So, and that's what has to begin to change, is for us to understand, how do all these things shape our sexual life today? And so one of the things that I did in my first book, Unwanted, was really looking at, could we begin to not just, address some of those behavior issues that you mentioned, but to develop a level of curiosity and kindness for why people are doing what they're doing. So, just one example would be, we found that the types of pornography that people pursued could be shaped, if not fully predicted, based on the unresolved stories of their life. So, and a lot of times, pornography might be one of those things that's like, well, yes, it's wrong, we shouldn't do it, so let's just say no, let's flee sexual immorality, end of story. And yet that paradigm does not help the majority of people, that just kind of say a prayer, try and fight it. And I don't think God, as the author of sex, the author of arousal and desire, wants us to be battling our sexual life for, through some of the best years of our life. So I think part of what we need to begin to do is to ask God, to ask therapists, to ask friends, like, why is it that I am drawn to this particular type of porn? Or why is it that whenever I'm alone, I find myself feeling very compulsive? Or why is it that after something happened to me, or some of these toxic messages that I received, I just have no desire whatsoever. And I kind of feel like I need a desire defibrillator to make this thing work, because I can't seem to find any. So I think that's what I'm trying to invite people into, is how can we develop a level of curiosity and kindness for the vast array of sexual problems that we're dealing with today? Because sexual problems, as much as we hate them, as much as we wish we could get rid of them, they are normal. What is abnormal is the ability to engage those problems with curiosity, kindness, and integrity.
Wow, those are normal. I've heard you say in some of your writing that our symptoms are the most honest places. Um,
Yes. Yes.
we
Yeah.
don't
So
like
this,
that. I'll just have to say, I don't like that reality. I think some of our listeners may say too, I hate that.
I do too. Yeah. And this is, this is a little bit of not quite nerd speak, but like, there was a psychoanalyst by the name of Lacan. And Lacan was, he was French, and he would say that every person has a symptom. And if one of your listeners will correct me or give me guidance, but I think how you pronounce symptom in French is symptôme. But then Lacan does this wordplay in the French between symptôme, meaning symptom, and the French word for holy man, which is saint home. And so he says every symptom is a symptom, symptom. And what he says is that the symptoms of his patient's life are the holy man. They are the prophets that are saying the thing that the patient does not want to acknowledge to him or herself. And that, I learned that in grad school, and I was like, that is gold, because that's, our life is always speaking to us through our symptoms. But most of us try to manage our symptoms. We try and suppress it, internet monitoring, praying, trying to get rid of it all, or we try and dismiss them as if like everybody's doing this, or it's not that big of a deal, or we try and excuse it. And I think the via media, which is the Latin phrase for the middle path in this world of sexual madness, of pathologizing or excusing, is really this sense of curiosity, understanding why we are drawn to what we're drawn to, understanding how our story shapes our sexual behaviors and the difficulties that we're in. So, all of that to say, we have so much to learn from our sexual difficulties. if we were willing to listen to them.
Mm. Wow. I'm challenged just hearing you put it in those words. I want to read another sentence that you have had out there for a while, and specifically about marriage. A committed relationship is doing exactly what it's designed to do when it flushes out the relational and sexual difficulties in each partner. Sometimes we think the relationship is broken, when in reality, the marriage system is working flawlessly. I think some of our married listeners would say, no, it's not working flawlessly. It's broken.
Yes. Yep. I'm upset at myself for writing that. I remember just some of that season that I was in my own marriage when that came up, because I think that was a counterintuitive way of seeing it, is that often I don't think that necessarily, it's not that I don't think that doesn't apply if you are in a marriage of domestic violence where
Yes.
there is a lot of personality structures and disorders, where there is not even a baseline level of safety or respect. That what I said there assumes some level of safety. It doesn't mean that all is well, but
Right.
it does mean that you're not threatened. But with that or with that caveat, that's what I've been learning lately, is that so much of what we complain about, uh, especially within marriage, like the marriage is the crucible. It is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing when it's revealing these places within me, within my spouse, where we remain underdeveloped, or maybe we are calloused in a particular way or underdeveloped in a particular way. And so in many ways, I'm no longer necessarily see the majority of marriages that I work with as broken, but it's a system that's doing exactly what it's designed to do, to be able to show and to highlight some of these areas that we have not had the courage or the energy or the willingness to be able to acknowledge. So I hope that's a helpful reframe, especially if you find yourself in a hard place, that marriage is a crucible, that is designed to highlight where you are overly calcified and where you are underdeveloped.
Yeah. Well, whether someone is married or not married who's listening, we've talked about a lot of the problem and how did we get here. You've alluded to addressing the story, looking at these attachment issues, childhood development, and all that can be a way out, a way forward. But
Mm-hmm.
let's get a little more specific about the hope. What's some of the
Mm-hmm.
process that somebody who's in the middle of a mess in these areas needs to embark on to contend with becoming more whole, more holy?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So one of the first things that comes to mind is there's a phrase in psychology that says the way that our parents talk to us becomes our inner voice. And so that's part of what you need to kind of take a step back when you're in some of these initial stages of, difficulty, whether it's in your marriage or a personal issue, is just to say, what's my inner voice as I'm even approaching this? And a lot of times we engage problems with hiding. Adam, that sense of hiding until he's called out. And then what does he do? Is he blames Eve. That's a really common tactic, is we hide from issues. We don't want to see them. And then when they actually come out, or when we have to confront something, then we blame ourselves or we blame someone else. And so I think just to be able to say, what is my inner voice as I am approaching these topics? And then it's that ability to kind of say, these problems that I'm facing are not random. There are some things in the present that I need to engage, but there's also a history in my past that I need to be able to engage. And that's where I think seeing a licensed therapist is a really good idea, getting into a group, some discussion group where you can actually be honest for the first time. So I think of Matthew 5:4 that says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. A lot of times we as Christians will ask for the forgiveness of our sins. We'll try and ask God for the power to stop these things. But I think a lot of times what we need a level of grief that this has been part of our life for a long time. And it could be we feel out of control within our sexual desires, or maybe we feel just some level of low desire, it's offline. And again, that sense of, instead of just trying to strong arm yourself to changing your body or your arousal, your desire, can you begin to grieve how hard it's been, how difficult it has been? And within grief and within kindness, I think that's where the beginnings or the early budding of change begins. And that's Romans 2:4 of, do you not know that it is the kindness of God that moves and that leads to change? So those are some basic things that I would say is just kind of opening up, talking about these things, engaging your story. But eventually you're going to have to develop a sense of self, ability to self-soothe, the ability to regulate your own emotions. And so there's a whole path ahead, but some of these initial phases need to be gentle. They need to be kind, and they need to be curious, because after that, there are some difficult things to begin to engage and confront. But this journey is supposed to be one not of kind of militant willing yourself to change, or confronting yourself in a very nasty way. It's about kindness, growth, and discovery along the way.
Yeah. So if I, as a person, did not experience being seen, soothed, safe, and secure, and that has been
Yep.
playing itself out in relationships, sexuality, issues, brokenness, or whatever, and I'm embarking on this, it occurs to me that I may not feel safe or secure with God either. And my ability to connect with Him and experience Him being part of my story, I have developed a paradigm in my head, if that's me, and frankly, that was a significant thing I had to deal with in my own story,
Mm.
where God is out there. God is the one, if I have been part of a faith community, who says, okay, you're supposed to do this and not do this. I can't. So all I know to do is ask Him for help, and it's not working. So I just try harder and I get more depressed. Um,
Yes.
what might you say about the process of walking this journey, even in my relationship with God?
Hmm. Yeah, such a lovely question. I mean, I think part of what we have to kind of step into is that there is a relationship, again, between our family of origin, our faith of origin, our faith community, and the way that we conceptualize God. And so I grew up in a family that I was much more of the golden child. My older brother and sister were more the classic out of control pastor's kid, rebel. At least my sister. My older brother was much more of he was reading Nietzsche at 16 and critiquing my dad's sermons, and kind of was much more of an intellectual contester. And so I kind of watched some of the difficulties that my older siblings brought into my family, and far more from my parents, parenting of those difficulties. And that was part of the way that I developed a way of life, is I'm going to kind of two-step that, I always want to present and manage the image that I present to the world that is good and has my stuff together, cares about the gospel. Like, all those things were true, but I always felt like I needed to hide some of the difficulties of my own real, honest emotions, or some of the darkness and heartache in my own heart. Well, that's how I thought God was relating to me as well. Is I basically was replaying, God, which is my parents, are very pleased with me when I'm doing great. But if there are difficulties, like, there is hell to pay for those. And so that became some of that early two-stepping. And it wasn't until I was in grad school where a professor basically said, if you name resurrection to escape the cross, or to escape the heartaches in your life, you have trivialized something of the cross. So he was really inviting us to step into our Good Friday experiences, that a lot of times as Christians we feel like we don't want to deal with Friday or Holy Saturday, which is a day of hell. Let's just move to Easter, let's just move to resurrection. And yet this professor was the first one that really said, you've got to grapple with your heartache, your darkness. And when you do that, it's not just that you are being honest, it's that you're also serving something of the Good Friday. You're serving something of the crucifixion to make known something to the world about the heartache and misery of human life. And that was kind of the first invitation I had from a person in Christian authority to actually be honest about my suffering and was not and what wasn't well. And so just having that professor again widened my understanding of it's possible that the God of the universe is neither surprised nor ashamed of what I have participated in, but actually understands these difficulties, these complexities, and these failures to be the very bridge that helps me to understand the gospel. So I think that was just having to have some corrective experiences to kind of say God is so much bigger and more kind than my current projections of what I believe God to be.
Wow, that's beautiful. And it occurs to me that in that very process, Good Friday tells us these are problems. It's not okay,
Yes.
and it's not it's not trivializing to sit there and need God's grace. It's actually trying to jump to Easter that tries to limit how big God's grace is. That this
Yes.
is so big, that's the only way we can deal with it. So big and so bad that we have to
Yes.
have God's grace to make it.
Amen. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's where I think it, we're not in the season of Holy Week, but that sense of Holy Week covers like Monday, Thursday, a lot of dimensions to that, but it's a day of betrayal. Friday is trauma, crucifixion, disillusionment. Saturday, a dead Messiah is a failed Messiah. So that sense of the hell of what Saturday was. And then eventually, of course, we know that Easter is coming. But when you're in Saturday, you have no idea that the next day is going to be Sunday. Sometimes it goes back to more Friday experiences. So that was just a really significant shift with regard to my own theological, but also psychological formation. Is that I think I grew up in a paradigm that was just constantly moving towards a dogmatic story of redemption. Like this thing was hard, it was difficult, but look at how God used that kind of Jeremiah 29:11 my way through life. And I just wasn't being honest. I wasn't training to be a good therapist at that time. And so I think that's the sense that if Jesus has walked and experienced all of this, it's not that we need to prioritize one or the other. It's that when we are honest about what we're in, uh, we are serving something of the Jesus story in our own integrity with our emotions, no matter where we are. So whether we are in, grief or we are in delight, we are making known something about the work of Jesus on our behalf.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
One more area I want to bring up that it's not particularly in your unwanted book. It's not front and center, but it's something I have heard a lot from people I have talked with, and that is the sexual brokenness far too often in Christian leaders, how that impacts the pain of people who hear about it, who see about it, and their picture of God and of community. I have done some pondering about why that must be so, why it seems at least to be so common among those in Christian leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, even if it is just an opinion, I'd love just to hear you ponder that for a minute, because I bet that you have some thoughts about what your attachment story, and
Mm-hmm.
getting under the surface and getting away from what's on the sin list or not on this, getting to some of these deeper matters has to say about the vulnerability we have sadly too often seen in Christian leaders.
Yes. No, you're spot on. I see a lot of things at play. So I don't know if I can do this in a minute, but would love to hear your thoughts as well, Carol. The first would just be I always go to Augustine, fourth century theologian, brilliant philosopher, written some of the most compelling books ever. And yet, what we also know of his sexual story is that he was likely abused and had, just levels of sexual desire that he found. He would write in the Confessions, "The frenzy of lust gripped me, and I surrendered myself entirely to lust." Well, he wasn't dealing with internet porn; it was orgies for him. Back in the fourth century, affair desires. So he kind of passed on to a lot of the Western world a level of shame and suspicion with regard to sexual desire. And so if you hate something about yourself, you're likely not going to develop this robust, generative, healthy theology of sex. So I think that has just been passed on through the centuries with regard to we have not had a good or thorough understanding of sex. But also, when you're looking at the majority of Christian leaders, and not all of them have been to seminary, but let's say most of them have. Well, when you are in seminary, you maybe have one class, not even a whole course in human sexuality. So, in a lot of times in the Christian world, it might be something on sexual brokenness. And so, the majority of our leaders have not had any education on sexual story, on sexual education whatsoever. So imagine seeing a cardiologist who has only had one class in the human heart in the entire course of their training. You would not go to see them. So I
Right.
think Christian leaders need to recognize that like they have inherited a very pathology based understanding of sex from Augustine and many others. That's the first issue. Second issue is that they have virtually no training, no education in these things. That needs to be corrected. And then third is they don't fully understand the power of their role and some of the isolation of their role. So a lot of times if you're working with a faith leader that has what they would refer to as an affair with someone in their congregation or their ministry, the training that we would receive as a licensed therapist would be that is not a mere affair, that is an abuse of power, and you're going to lose your license on behalf of that. So we don't have that in a lot of faith leadership. And then also that sense of you have a lot of power, you feel very isolated, and then you begin to lean more on secrets and sexual behavior. So I think there's a number of tributaries that flow into this river of sexual misconduct
Yeah.
among clergy. But what makes me so angry, Carol, is that we have known for hundreds of years, centuries. And so the bigger question that I keep finding myself in is why do we let this continue to go on? Like, this is not new. This has been going on for centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, how would you answer that?
Well, I share your distress. Anger is a good word for it. This,
Yeah.
and to use James' words in a different context, this ought not to be. Um,
Yeah.
One of the things that I have pondered is the training, especially in the contemporary Western Church, although it's gone back even longer than the contemporary Western Church, has been so focused on information and performance that our leaders,
Mm.
by and large, have no or a very limited paradigm about dealing with their own stuff. And if they are not uh, understanding what is required to deal with their own stuff, it's going to break down sometime later, and
Mm.
they certainly are not going to minister to others. So it's their own empty souls. It's the matters in their own heart that they have never dealt with and frankly never been helped to deal with, perhaps
Yes.
especially in the sexual arena, because God and sex are on opposite sides of the universe, although nobody would would acknowledge that intellectually, but the heart feels that way. So if I'm not doing okay, well, this is the only outlet I have. Nobody has helped our leaders or any of us, by and large, find the pathways to deal with these things and become integrated and whole, and dealing with, as you have said, desire the way God made it. He built us with desire, including sex was his idea. What does that mean for, first of all, unmarried persons? And then what does it mean in married persons when things aren't going great in marriage? We've alluded to some of those things in story, but without contending with that, the church by and large, and leaders in particular, are just set up sitting ducks.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so well said. I don't know who frames it like this, but just that sense of a lot of Christian leaders, they have a particular charisma, they have a level of gifts and talents, but their character has not developed commensurate with their with their talent. So I was in I don't know where I was, maybe Nashville last month, and talking with some music producers who had been in the industry for decades. And they were saying that one of the things that's emerging is some of these young worship leaders are getting massive financial contracts, and they are talented and they are incredible, but they're getting huge financial payouts for these things, but also they have the talent, but they've had no spiritual formation, and so the sexual problems that they're encountering are immense. And again, it's just that sense of different industries are set up on rewarding talent, charisma, certain gifts that appear to be there, but then we just don't develop and reward the gifts of spiritual formation and maturity and love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. So, yeah, they have not, as you said, they have not dealt with their own stuff.
Yeah. Well, hats off to you and others for helping people learn to deal with their stuff. We're going to have a bunch of links in the show notes. Among the things that we are going to link to, and I just want to give you a moment to mention, is your upcoming sexual attachment conference
Mm-hmm.
that you are spearheading with a couple others. Such an important piece, and you have a lot of what you do that's speaking into this, but just a moment about that upcoming conference.
Yeah, so this is the fourth annual conference. I can't believe this is already the fourth, but it's called the Sexual Attachment Conference. And the conference is designed to help people understand how does my story, which is my family of origin, my trauma history, some of the messages that I received about sex growing up, or the messages I did not receive about sex, how does all that shape my relationship to sex and desire today? So, uh, two of the paradigms that I mentioned earlier, the pathology-based paradigm, which is like we're just gonna, everything is wrong, it's all sin, but then you give people almost no language to develop their sexual life or story or understand why they do what they do. Or maybe more of the progressive paradigm, which is like we want to reduce shame in people's life, but in their effort to reduce shame, they don't always invite people to understand why they do what they do or development. So this conference, we're really trying to, help people to understand their family of origin, some of the difficulties that they faced, and then build that bridge to how does all of that shape my relationship to sex. So uh, I'm going to be doing that with my friend and colleague Adam Young, who hosts a podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves. And what Adam recently told me was like, he said, Jay, this is the conference that I wish I had when I was in my early 20s or early on in my marriage. So we are the primary hosts of it. And then we also have a guest by the name of Sheila Ray Gregoire, who wrote a book called The Great Sex Rescue and many others. But the three of us are going to be really talking about understanding our sexual story and really trying to give people some guidance, some resources, and some language so that they don't feel like they are completely unprepared for some of the sexual challenges that we know so many of us are facing.
Yeah. Well,
So if people can go to sexualattachment.com to learn more about that event, to register. But yeah, I've loved doing that conference the last couple of years.
That's great. Awesome. And what an important topic. This has been very rich, Jay. Thank you so much for you, for your work, and you continued speaking into this challenging but really, really important area. I'm blessed to know you, and many blessings to you.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, and I appreciate all of your wisdom and the fire that you bring to this work as well.
Thank you. I say it all the time, check the links. Sexualattachment.com gets you to the details of the conference that we spoke about at the end. You'll also find in the links Jay Stringer's website, his social media, and his book, Unwanted. I also want to let you know again about my latest book, Sexpectations: Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. This book talks about your story and what it looks like on a practical basis to invite Jesus into your story. This is not talking about what's right or wrong. It's not about what's on or not on the sin list. It's about seeing how you came to be where you are, which Jesus knows and understands. And how do you experience Jesus knowing and understanding that, and what difference he makes in your story? It's not a zap, it's a process. So, Sexpectations. Also, find out a lot of related resources at yoursexpectations.com. You can download a free chapter, but we also have a bunch of other stuff. Some other free downloads there for you. We got a quiz. We've got a 30-day devotional that you can take advantage of, and some other stuff. So come check that out. I hope you are subscribed to our channel. Please hit the subscribe button if you're not, and tell somebody else. Share this with somebody who is struggling with their sexual stuff. It will help them feel not alone, and it will also help encourage them about some next steps that they can take. I'll see you next time. Until then, God bless you.